added into the loneliness of being a CEO has really exacerbated a movement of many founders being depressed, having panic attacks.
Awesome. Well, hard to come after that, but appreciate his remarks. So again, I'm Diana Ransom. I'm an executive editor at Inc. magazine, and I'm really pleased to be here with Rebecca Price, who is also, just in case you all forgot, she's a partner at Primary Ventures. So I know we're here to talk about the role of entrepreneurs, but before we dig in there, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about your own background. You know, tell us a little bit about you and what you do at Primary.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. So the only way to think about my job today is to look back on my journey to this role. So I think about my career in 3 separate chapters. The first chapter of my career started in corporate America. I started my career at Johnson & Johnson, where I had the privilege of being in an HR rotational program. So I'm in the field of people and talent. I studied psychology and organizational psychology. And my 8 years at Johnson & Johnson afforded me an opportunity to have 12 different assignments, 6, 12, or 18 months each. I lived all over the world, and I was able to work across all different operating companies. And that was really the best startup boot camp I could have had, because I was able to see the HR and people function at scale. I was able to see best practices, but have to translate those practices into different cultures and teams. It led me to about a 10-year career where I had 3 different chief people officer roles in startups, each one very different markets, different culture, different teams, different dynamics, and be able to bring those best practices into those startups to help them scale. And for the last 3.5 years, then I've had the privilege of bringing all that learning and best practices into Primary Venture Partners. For those of you who didn't raise your hand when she said who's heard of Primary, the quick 20-second commercial is Primary is a New York City-based seed stage investment firm. We lead seed stage rounds. We focus in 5 verticals. So if you're looking for seed capital in any of these 5 verticals, we'd love to meet you. Healthcare, AI, fintech, go-to-market, and supply chain.
So I'm glad you mentioned that. So obviously you work with seed stage companies. What is, among these cohort, what is the biggest hurdle that they sort of face when they're trying to get their companies to the next level?
Yes, so to be a founder means you are finding a blank white space and you believe a product needs to exist to solve some sort of problem. Being a founder is about finding customers, developing 0 to 1, raising money, and finding product market fit. All those skills are really hard. I think where we see the companies, once they have product market fit, which is not easy, but once you do, they stall out because you kind of stumble on that journey from what does it mean to be a founder, where you're doing all that 0 to 1 stuff, to being a CEO, which means you are scaling, leading teams, and delegating that work through others.
Yeah. In what capacity are founders sort of standing in their own way in terms of growing?
Yeah, so I always like to ground that question into the definition of a CEO. So people don't actually realize what a CEO's job description is, because a CEO really shouldn't be doing a lot of individual contributor work. A CEO's job I like to think about as being defined as MVP. So the M stands for money. You need to make sure there's enough money in the bank. That can be through revenue and sales. That can be through capitalization and fundraising. So forever as a CEO, you are in charge of the M, the money. The V is vision. You are responsible for developing a vision, articulating that vision, clarifying that vision, reinforcing that vision again and again. You know you're being a great CEO if you feel like you are sick of hearing yourself repeat yourself, because adults need to hear things 7 times before they actually believe it. So you're going to be repeating that vision again and again. And then the P is people. You are in charge of recruiting people, re-recruiting. So don't ever take for granted, like once someone's there, they're set. You got to re-recruit, and you're going to do that through that vision. And you need to constantly be aligning that team to perform. So I think most founders don't realize that MVP is the job description of a CEO, and they're out there doing all this like frontline work, and they forget to hire people in who are the experts, and they can scale from there.
So just not hiring people at the appropriate time then. That's fascinating that it takes 7 times to learn something, or to like hear it 7 times before you actually retain it.
Yeah.
That explains so much, you know?
I mean, humans resist change, right? So when you hear something that's maybe a change, you're like you're naturally not going to want to believe it. And maybe the second time you're like, oh, did I hear that right? So if something is changing, that you need to really make sure, oh, they're serious about this, and I better pay attention.
Right. Okay. So I'm an entrepreneur. I'm running my company. I'm sweating bullets. I'm in the grind every day, and then next thing you know, you realize like, at what point do you realize you're a founder, but then you need to be a CEO?
Yeah. So founders have to be good at sales. You have to be good at sales because, one, you are raising money. That is selling. You have to be able to convince investors that you are backable and your idea is backable. Sales also is in getting your first customers. And then sales is also in recruiting talent. There's tons of sales. So you're going to be in those early days constantly selling to raise money, to get customers, and to recruit talent. When you start having a backload of customers, that's why sales is often one of the first roles get hired into, because you're going to switch from founder-led sales to actually having sales in-house. So obviously you're building a product in the back house, so you're going to have engineers in those early days. But sales is one of those first hats that a founder would take off. And I would think about a CEO who is finding product market fit and has a huge sales pipeline to actually think about what is that first sales hire.
So you start with sales, and then where do you go from there?
Yeah. Well, so I just want to, the earliest hires, even before you finding product market fit, you're going to be finding engineering.
Okay.
Then you're going into sales.
That
and
makes
then,
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from sales, you're going to think about customer success.
Right, because you need a product,
Yes.
and then you need to sell
the product, and
There
then
we
you
go.
got to maintain your customers.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's how to work it. But so sometimes people stay too long in the role of, like, quote unquote entrepreneur, and like, how do you course correct?
Yeah. Surrounding yourself with people and teams is absolutely the way to start. And that doesn't have to be people who work for you or with you. So finding mentors, finding advisors, finding people who are really good at the things you're not, finding people who you can have honest, vulnerable conversations with, who you can say, God, I'm really scared about this, or I have no idea how to do this, or I made a mistake. Like, find those people, and find people who've walked that road before. The people who've been on the journey, who can calm you down when you think something's on fire, or who can say, like, okay, like, we can fix this. We got this.
Yeah. What I mean, not to plug Primary here, but so I've managed all sorts of packages at Inc. And we were actually the first ones to do a quote unquote 30 under 30 list, even before Forbes, by the way. They clearly won. But so what often happens with young entrepreneurs in particular is that they're in a role and it goes off the rails because they can't manage well. And I think it's helpful to work with an organization that, like, actually has a talent pipeline for people.
Yep.
I mean, is that rare among
Yeah,
this world?
I do think venture has really tried to differentiate themselves from each other. And the way that Primary differentiate is we have a 2-to-1 ratio of operators to investors, which means for every investor we have 2 people who work at Primary who have operated in startups previously. And we're organized around the areas that we know every seed stage company needs: finance, go-to-market, and people and talent. And we are embedding ourselves in those companies and helping them. So I spend the majority of my day managing a team that's helping recruit, but actually spending my time with founders as a fractional chief people officer, helping them, coaching them on management, leadership, team building, delegation, org design, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, that's really often where it goes off the rails is people.
Yes.
So
Everything's a people problem.
Yeah, no, it's truly helpful to have that as a resource for entrepreneurs. So at Inc. all the time we hear there's no CEO school. Obviously you can get an MBA, but you're learning all sorts of things that are not necessarily pertinent to the job. So there's no CEO school. Nobody teaches you how to be a CEO. So then the question is, like, how do you learn to be a CEO, and can you learn it?
Yeah. So I actually was able to spend time with this incredible coach, Rick Hagbird. He's coached over 2,200 Silicon Valley founders, and I spent time with him around what actually makes someone a successful CEO. And he studied the traits of founders that have had 10x, and he actually told me that you can only move 3 points on the scale. So some of it is you just naturally are a good leader or you're not. But a lot of it is about being able to have focus and clarity, face confrontation, delegate, like get work done through others, articulate a clear vision, and then ultimately have empathy and human connection.
Okay, so I mean that's kind of tough for people too. It's like the empathy. Nobody's gonna like believe in your company more than you, and I think it's hard for founders to kind of realize that we're all humans, and they have to go home to their families too.
Right.
So I guess how do you sort of get other people along to your vision?
Yeah, I mean that's why this one competency for any aspiring founder out there is to really get good at selling, because you do want to be able to sell the vision and get people to feel really motivated. So there's extrinsic and intrinsic motivators. Extrinsic motivation would be the recognition, the rewards, the like things that come from the outside that motivate you. Extrinsic motivators actually cap out and don't drive like engagement and the discretionary effort. Discretionary effort is defined as what you're thinking about when you're taking a shower or driving your car, like those extra thoughts beyond the to-do list. And that comes from intrinsic motivation. And so how do you actually get people to be intrinsically motivated? There has to be an emotional connection to the work. Now, emotional connection can come from the mission of the company, but it can also come from the relationships people have at the company. It can come from the learning that they have. Like intrinsic motivation can come from a lot of different places, but when I interview people, I always try to understand what's motivating them at this moment to try to find a good match of will this company in this role drive an intrinsic motivator that you have right now.
They usually say something like people who have friends at work are more likely to stay at that job.
Right.
So that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And it's also the relationship with your manager. If there's actually, all the research shows, if there's one relationship that dictates whether you stay or leave, it's your relationship with your manager. And so when I was a chief people officer of like 1,000-person company, I would spend the majority of my time focusing on frontline managers, because frontline managers are actually the most significant touch point for engagement and retention for the majority of employees. And so many people in startups are thrown into first-time manager jobs, and you don't learn how to be a manager. You don't learn in school. You know, you study in engineering, you study marketing, right? You study finance, but all of a sudden you're managing people.
You could study management.
Yeah. Sure.
But I mean,
most
I think
people.
most people struggle.
Most people struggle, and there's a lot of scaffolding, not a lot of scaffolding in startups to really teach those basics.
Right. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about the loneliness of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you have a co-founder, you have like a comrade in arms in effect. But like, how do you deal with how do you recommend people kind of like communicate with other people? Like, how do you network when you're an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so I've never been a founder, and I have obviously huge like respect because it's a very hard job. And even if you have a co-founder, there is still a loneliness to it because the board looks to the CEO. Everything rolls up to that CEO. And what we've seen over the last several years, unfortunately, at Primary is a lot of mental health issues. I think coming out of COVID, the loneliness of COVID and isolation of COVID added into the loneliness of being a CEO has really exacerbated a movement of many founders being depressed, having panic attacks. And we've had substance abuse, depression, like we've had a lot of very serious mental health issues that we've seen. And so at Primary, we've really tried to take a proactive stance and intervention to provide support for founders around normalizing talking about mental health. We have a company called Alma in our portfolio. Alma is a marketplace for mental health that has incredible providers in there across all different health plans for very low rates, and just normalizing the fact that you need an executive coach and you need a mental health support as well.
That's fascinating. I didn't realize it was higher. Yeah. Like the rates of mental health crisis. And then if you're starting a company with maybe a co-founder who happens to be your spouse or a loved one or even a family member, I hear that can go wrong at times. You know?
Yeah, so we work a lot with co-founder coaches, and co-founder coaches use the same skills as marriage counselors use, because it's all about like proactive communication, appreciating each other, being able to sort of know when to compromise and know when to not, and building the foundations to navigate challenging times before they happen, so that you have in your toolbox agreements around when we hit these difficult times, how will we approach them?
And it's also realizing, I think, to some degree, what you were saying earlier, that it takes 7 times to communicate something. Yeah. And then, like, okay, they didn't hear you the first time. Yeah. Because nobody hears you the first time. Right. And I think that gives people some grace, too. And then what's your overall advice for an entrepreneur who wants to kind of, like, step it up and become a CEO?
Yeah. So first, I think there is a moment of self-awareness. So one thing that I run a 10-week cohorted class for every new founder that comes into the Primary portfolio, all about this transition from founder to CEO. And the absolute first class, the first thing we talk about is reflecting on your inner self. Who are you? Like, reflect on the times. When have you been your best? When you were on the the best team, not the most productive team, but when you were your best on a team, what was true about that team and why did you show up with your best traits? Your best partnerships, what was true about that partnership? When you're stressed, how do you show up, right? Like what comes out? When you have to make decisions, how do you make decisions? Do you ask a lot of people? Do you do a lot of research? Do you go into a hole, right? This ability to have self-awareness about who you are is the absolute most important grounding point, because we use this tool at Primary called a user manual, where you can then share with others who you are, how you like to make decisions, how you act under stress, ways to win a gold star, and then you're actually bringing in a team and people who know how to work with you. Sometimes relationships can feel like a laboratory experiment where I'm going to say something to you and you're going to be like, and I'm going to be like, okay, how did she respond? Next time I'm going to try it differently. But the best founders, if you want to really become a CEO, it's give people the keys, know truly who you are, and let people know that, so that then you can have these really productive relationships.
Do you sort of like fill out a memo and send it along?
I'm happy to share this. We actually have a one-pager with all these questions about questions about me, and then questions about how I work. And we strongly recommend you minimally fill it out for yourself. Ideally, you're sharing it with your closest team, but a best practice would be you share it with everyone. And at Primary, everyone has a user manual. We have a Google Drive where you can go in and read every single person's Google user manual.
It's like you have your own file.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, and tremendous.
Yeah. Thank you so much.